We've now heard three wonderful presentations on three quite different environmental topics. Our next presenter is Brendan Foran, who is the CEO of Greening Australia, and he will speak on environmental restoration from the Australian perspective, but with many lessons for Rotarians in other parts of the globe. But before I introduce Brendan, I've been asked to give a little bit more background to ESRAG. Now, ESRAG is a relatively new Rotary action group, but it's growing rapidly and currently has over 620 members worldwide. And while ESRAG members are working on many international and local environmental projects, we've also set up 12 dynamic regional chapters in different parts of the world to give members opportunities to network with people in their own region and to plan more locally based projects. And I'm currently the chair of the ESRAG regional chapter in the Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Islands region, which we have abbreviated as ANSPI. Although we're still in the early stages of building the chapter and planning our way forward, we're already involved in a number of exciting projects concerning plastics in the oceans, Rotarians for Bees, and I'll tell you more about that later on, and tree planting. So I was going to give you some more detail about what we're doing in Down Under, but I think I might skip over that for our timing issues today. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next guest speaker, as I said before, Brendan Foran. And I first met Brendan 3 years ago when he was a keynote speaker at a district conference in the historic city of Bendigo in Victoria, Australia. And ironically, Bendigo was at the heart of the great Victorian gold rush in the second half of this 19th century, during which 1.4 million tonnes of gold was extracted from Victoria alone, bringing enormous wealth to our country, but accompanied by widespread damage to the natural environment and to what Fred Kahir calls the Aboriginal cultural landscape. Brendan will touch on these and other impacts on the Australian environment today. So about Brendan, since joining Greening Australia as CEO in 2011, Brendan has led an organisation-wide governance and strategy reform program that has led to greater levels of impact, efficiency and resilience. Before joining Greening Australia, Brendan was the Corporate Affairs Manager Eastern States for Alcoa of Australia. He holds an MBA and an advanced diploma in business management from the University of Ballarat. He has extensive experience in business management and strategy development with strengths in government relations and liaison, community and stakeholder relations and organisational transformation. He was a 2011 Rotary Foundation Group Study Exchange participant in Iceland and a 2016 Harvard Club of Australia non-profit fellow. Brendan will speak to us today about some of the factors impacting on Australia's natural environment, the current state of the Australian environment, and the work of Greening Australia to help restore the environment of our very beautiful country. Brendan, thank you for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you, Pat. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so fantastic to be here today. Happy World Environment Day to you all, and recognising that some people are joining this presentation from a long way around the world. While this has a very specific Australian flavour, one of the things I'll attempt to do is try and bring it up to an international level as much as I can, noting very importantly that we're a practical on-ground organisation. So while we operate to a set of global strategies, I will regularly bring it down to what's actually happening on the ground or in the Australian landscape. So I always start with this slide here. We believe people thrive when nature thrives, which in many ways is Greening Australia's equivalent of the four-way test. We think about our vision and our mission, and we believe we're both a people and nature organisation, and we also believe, and interesting on the back of some of Jonathan's commentary there before and some of the questions from the people on the Zoom call, is we believe that the economies, communities and environment are all connected in ways that benefit them all. So as I said, I always start with this slide, mainly because this is the most important relationship in our organisation. It is the on-ground officer, the person that's doing the work in the field, so our production line, and the landholder that they're working with. That landholder could be Indigenous, as you're seeing in this picture here. They could be a farmer. they could be a national park, etc. But it doesn't matter how good the plans and the strategies that the CEO and the chair of an organisation may come up with. If the magic's not happening on the ground at a relationship level between the field officer and the landholder, then the plans are not going to come to fruition. So we always start with that. The other thing that we always start with, which I'm just about to take you through, is an acknowledgement of country. So Pat just spoke about the Aboriginal landscape, and we've just finished a week here in Australia called Reconciliation Week, which talks about the progress that we're on around reconciling and inclusion with our Indigenous owners, the Aboriginal people. And I think with what we're seeing happening around the world at the moment, this is relevant not just in Australia but globally. So we talk about acknowledging the traditional owners and paying our respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. And just to put a local flavour on that, like many of you, I've been working from home for the past 3 months, which is interesting, an interesting way to run a national organisation. But I'm about 50 metres from the Murray River, so the people in Australia would know where I'm talking about, which is the largest, longest water source in Australia, a very dry landscape. And I live on a man-made lake that was actually created to create irrigation and bring agriculture into the region. So it's on the border between Victoria and New South Wales, and it's Yorta Yorta country. So the original owners of this landscape are Yorta Yorta people. And in paying my respects to them, I also pay my respects to the elders of your particular landscape. So briefly getting through a couple of slides here. Greening Australia is a national organisation with global ambition, and we've been around since 1982, and we were established by government, and we believe that our reason to be, along with our vision of healthy and productive landscapes where people and nature thrive, is solving great environmental challenges, demonstrating proof of impact, and producing inspirational stories. And so while the great environmental challenges of every generation may change, we believe for this generation it is taking direct action on climate change, reversing the decline of threatened species, supporting traditional owners and their aspirations for restoring country, creating sustainable cities for people and wildlife, supporting regenerative agriculture and forestry systems, and saving, not just preserving, saving the Great Barrier Reef, which is in decline. So I'm going to step you through those in a little bit now, so I'll keep moving rather than pause there. As I mentioned there in my earlier comments, while we are a very local and direct action-based organisation in the Australian context, the way that we put together our strategies is that we work out what those great environmental challenges are, and then we look at the research, science and impact-focused based strategies which exist at a regional, national and international level. So the ones, I've tried to pick up the ones that people on this call would be most familiar with, which is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which I believe are a very great improvement on the Millennium Goals. They were a good start, but I think the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are a great improvement. And consistent with my comments there before about the economy, the community and the environment being connected in ways that benefit them all as we pursue our vision of healthy and productive landscapes where vision and nature thrive, we pick off 10 of the Millennium Goals. No poverty, good health and well-being, quality education, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, and all the way through to partnerships for the goals. So while we don't design regional, national and international strategies, the way we design our programs and how we put the investment on the ground to take direct action on global environmental issues is we choose a target that we believe we can achieve ourselves, and then we also set a target that we believe through our partnerships that we can achieve. So the first program, so just flicking back here, Great Southern Landscapes. So this area here in the green, if you follow my mouse on the screen. Australia, for those that are wondering how big Australia is, it's about the same size as the US, but our population is only about 24 million by comparison. So this area in the green here is largely agricultural. The bits in the dots there is Adelaide, Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney and Brisbane. So that's our nature and cities. Tasmania, the little island off an island, speaks for itself. And the area in orange or Mojave red there is the area which we believe is Indigenous land. So that covers the whole landscape. And then the green area is the Great Barrier Reef catchment. So these are the rivers, the estuaries, the wetlands which flow out onto the Great Barrier Reef. So I'll step you through briefly of these different programs now. So since European settlement, which in Australia was in the late 1700s, about 1788, the first fleet of Europeans landed in Australia, about 90 million hectares. 90 million hectares, I'm not sure what that is in acres. We talk about hectares in Australia, so whoever's got a calculator there might want to convert that into acres. But 90 million hectares of land has been cleared for the purposes of agriculture, urban populations, irrigation, etc. So 90 million hectares. And our goal is to reinstate by 2050 10 million hectares of that land, because we believe and we know from our science-based approach that we can achieve that goal of integrated economic, environment and community outcomes by reinstating 10 million hectares of that 90 million hectares and get all the environmental benefits that previously would have come from the 90 million hectares. This is the program that Greening Australia is most well known for, large-scale tree planting activities, and a bit later I'll actually talk about some of the on-ground statistics that we achieve year on year. The Great Barrier Reef. So the two greatest challenges facing the Great Barrier Reef are, one, climate change, which I think we all understand, and the second one is water quality. And so climate change basically will create a series of events, bleaching, acidification, ocean warming, etc. That's been very well understood. And a lot of the stuff that Jonathan was speaking about previously, and of course, tree planting in our Great Southern Landscapes program, which actually sequesters carbon out of the atmosphere, helps contribute to the climate change #1 priority. But one of the projects that we've taken on is actually improving water quality flowing out onto the reef. So the way I like to think about this is the Great Barrier Reef is facing the greatest challenge of its life, the greatest health challenge of its life in climate change. Let's say that it's got cancer. And while it's got cancer, it's also dealing with a dose of the flu. And the dose of the flu is the 10 million tonnes of sediment which are flowing out of the Great Barrier Reef catchments, full of nutrient, full of sediment, other pollutants, etc., and flowing onto the Great Barrier Reef each year and pushing that all north. The coastal stream is pushing it all north, and obviously we're in the southern hemisphere, and dropping that sediment all over a reef which is already dealing with warmer temperatures, acidification and bleaching. So there's 10 million tonnes a year which is coming out. That's a lot of sediment. And what's happened in the Great Barrier Reef catchments is there's been over-clearing. The soils are very, very fine. So once you break the surface, they erode easily. And you also have high rainfall events on the edge of the World Heritage Area. We started working on this program in 2016. So Richard Branson launched it for us, and it's grown into a $40 million program. It's the largest water quality program of its type. And when we started, most people said to us, you can't do it. You can't fix these eroding gullies and these leaking wetlands. And in the first year, we reduced the sediment off one site flowing onto the reef by 97%. Our target was 50 to 80%, and we reduced it by 97%. That exceeded our benchmarks and our thresholds, but we've maintained it for the 5 years since. So this is a solution that can be exported all the way around the world. Despite the perception that Australia is a country where a lot of people live in the bush and by the beach, the reality is, like most other parts of the world, the majority of Australians actually live in cities. And places like Melbourne and Sydney are populations of 5 million and growing regularly and rapidly. So with the majority of Australians living in cities that are expanding, one of the things that we're working on is how you introduce increased amounts of canopy cover, so tree coverage, and biodiversity into urban landscapes. Without going into the deep science behind it, I think it's never been more obvious than the last 3 months as the world's dealt with coronavirus about how much communities value green, open spaces in highly urbanised areas. This program originally was one of the, please excuse the crude description here, I think was the least sexy program we did. You know, talking about tree coverage in cities. Over the last couple of months, my mind has changed completely on this. This is one of the most strategic, value-adding and exciting programs that we do because it has all these interactions with education, older members of the community, multiple stakeholders like water utilities and National Park Service, etc. So this is growing rapidly. And just last week, we announced a $3 million program in Western Sydney with the government of New South Wales. Tasmania, so as I said there before, the island off an island. This is the landscape where we believe we can absolutely prove our vision of healthy, productive landscapes where people and nature thrive. Tasmania's population is about 1 million, so it's relatively small, and it has all this competition for natural resources and the environment. So depending on where you sit, you will describe it as one of the greenest places on the planet, but then other people will say it's one of the most opportune economic landscapes in the world because of its natural values. The balance in Tasmania can easily be met by a compromise between them all. But what's interesting about Tasmania is not only do some of the rarest animals and species in Australia exist there, they are found nowhere else in the world. And so it's got this potential to be an island arc, a showcase for the whole planet of how you can have economies, communities and environments connected in ways that benefit them all. And finally, from a program point of view, Thriving on Country is more a thematic than a program which seeks to deliver large amounts of trees on the ground or reduce water quality impacts on the Great Barrier Reef. This is about a belief system in how we engage with Indigenous Australia and how we represent traditional land management values and how we manage the continent moving forward. What's really interesting and been a very positive outcome of the most recent bushfire situation in Australia is increased recognition that Aboriginals have been managing the landscape for 60,000 years. And managing it not just for food production, but also managing it for increased biodiversity values, but also reducing the ever-present risk in Australia, which people in California and people in South America and Spain and Portugal who may be on this call would understand, that bushfires present to communities. And Aboriginals have been exceptional at managing fire impacts across the landscape, for, as I said, for 60,000 years. And very pleasingly, in the last couple of years, I think recognition of their inherent and explicit expertise in this area is now starting to be drawn out. So just very briefly, because these slides and these presentations will be made available to you via Pat at your request, is, you know, we pride ourselves on what we get done on the ground each year. And so last year alone, we planted about 5.2 million trees. For those that aren't aware, Australia's financial year is start of July to end of June, not the calendar year. So we planted 5.2 million trees last year. And they are all responding to those 5 key threshold environmental challenges that I spoke about: climate change, water quality in the Great Barrier Reef, increased urbanising of the cities, et cetera, et cetera. So all indexed against those strategic challenges. This year we'll plant 7.5 million. You know, the total amount of carbon that was sequestered just from new plantings. So it doesn't take into account the fact that over the last 10 years since I've been with Greening Australia, we put $300 million of activity onto the ground. So just last year, 20,000 tonnes of new carbon is being drawn out of the atmosphere, and that will keep accumulating as these trees continue to grow. And then down the bottom, we still have a very strong connection with the community. So there's about 7,500 volunteers that we engage with every single year. But it's important that you have a forward focus. This is the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So in case I hadn't made the point clearly a bit earlier, Greening Australia is not a conservation organisation. We are a restoration organisation. So we go into country land that is heavily degraded, highly impacted by a whole range of reasons, and we start restoring it and bringing it back to life. Our targets just in Australia for 2030, in line with the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, is about 330,000 hectares. And each year, sequentially, we'll build up to about 1 million tonnes of carbon being sequestered, and we'll plant 500 million trees. It's important to remember that, particularly given last year we planted 5.2 and this year we're planting 7.5, and hopefully I'll be able to explain why those stats are so important in terms of what comes next, and the rest is obviously self-explanatory here. So now getting into something that I think is an important discussion point for Rotary and many people around the world is, you'll often hear that the problem with meeting environmental challenges is money. I'm going to tell you that I don't think that's the problem anymore. I think there's other issues which are the biggest barriers to scaling for real impact. So just by, I won't step you through the grey box to the left-hand side of the screen, but if you look there, there's a lot of money that's sloshing around in the global economic system, ready to go into environmental causes. Just in Australia alone, and some of these direct deals that we're working on are about to land just for Greening Australia, one organisation in one country. There's a lot of money out there. What I think the problem is that there's no shortage of capital, there's a shortage of deals. Money's great, everyone knows the capitalist system, money's great at finding its way to the source, but if in environmental world what you're trying to do is get money onto the ground to take real action, there's a real issue on the other side, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But some of it is about the way that we've, as a community and as a global community, the way that we've tried to address environmental challenges in the past. I'm just going to make the point here as well before I go into this next slide is, if people can see me waving my hands around my head here, it's not because I have a tick or anything, it's because there's a tremendous amount of flies where I am. And I think it's because I'm near a water source, but also because the bushfires that I'll touch briefly on later, we're only about 30 kilometres away from here, and so much habitat's been destroyed. We've seen all this migration of native birds and insects over to what is drought refuge effectively. So I've never seen flies this bad this time of year where I live. But yeah, if you see me doing this, that's me just waving flies away. Okay. Now on your screen, this slide's a little bit blurry, and I apologise for that. So remembering those 2030 goals that I spoke about and the growth in our organisation in the last couple of years, 5 million trees to 7 million, we've pretty much spent the last 5 to 7 years getting ourselves ready for the next decade to deliver at scale. The green line here talks about the growth that we can expect as an organisation if we keep going the way we've always tackled environmental challenges. So this is basically 3-year government grants, generous donations from philanthropists, trusts and foundations providing year-on-year support, etc., which I describe, and a lot of volunteers helping out with the work, by the way. I describe this as organic growth. So this is business as usual, year-on-year growth, etc. And that will show you that by following the green line, that by the time Greening Australia gets to the end of the decade of ecosystem restoration as prescribed by the United Nations, we'll be an organisation that's $100 million per annum of turnover. Look, that's a great story for an organisation to grow from, when I started, we were about 23 million, we're now about 35 million, onto 100 million, that's good. But we won't have met our challenges of Vision 2030. So while we've grown the organisation, we haven't met the challenges that we set out to do. If we think about this just in simple dollar terms, Aussie dollars, and you could do a US conversion or a wherever you are, conversion into your own money, this black line here shows you the type of growth that we need to have as an organisation to actually meet our 2030 goals in today's dollars. And I will tell you that by 2030, we need to be turning over about $600 million per annum as an organisation. The key assumption there is that we will get environmental markets working and innovative financing approaches. So blended finance structures, environmental credits like carbon credits, water quality credits, etc., and that will fill the gap. I'm now actually saying to you that that is only part of the challenge. Just as I said there before, there is not a shortage of, there is a shortage of, it's not that there's a shortage of capital, there's a shortage of deals. So even if in that previous slide, or you just pick this $600 million off here, the thing that I would say to you is, if all that money got unlocked straight away, the sector wouldn't be able to execute it. It would not be able to deliver against the scale of the investment, because we simply do not have the barriers, the infrastructure barriers removed out of the way. And I think these are global barriers, by the way. And the one is that we still use a lot of volunteers and a lot of hired labour to plant trees. So we need to use technology. We need to use drones for mapping, for tree planting. We need to use 24-hour production cycles like industry does. And we need to unlock barriers around land and seed. We also need to have enhanced capability around people, process and partnerships. So if I look at the profile of the Greening Australia workforce in the last couple of years, we've employed resource economists, we've employed engineers, we've employed technology process experts, etc. And it's all about this concept here of unlocking barriers. And in the Rotary context, which is where I think Rotary is expert at, is creating an ecosystem where you replicate great ideas and great initiatives all the way around the planet. So in a nutshell, the way that I would describe this slide here, because this is the key to our Vision 2030 and the planet moving forward on great ecosystem challenges, is we simply cannot do business as usual and think that we're going to meet the challenges of the day. However, for a Rotarian who may be thinking, what can I do? It is still an absolute part of the mix to donate money and donate time and plant trees by the traditional method. However, we also need to ensure that we unlock the finance in a couple of ways by supporting good policy around environmental credit markets and innovative finance. What you might therefore do at a personal level is you may shift some of your own personal portfolio across into ESG. And then on the other side is we need to invest in technology and capability and a platform style approach rather than a pipeline approach to actually ensure that we can scale proportionate to the level of capital that's available. I want to briefly touch on this, which is our role in bushfires. I haven't tried to gloss over this unnecessarily. It's very, very important, but the reality is for Australians is that bushfires and the increased threat of bushfires is something that we live with on a year-to-year basis. Last year was the worst bushfires that we've ever seen. And 1 billion animals alone were killed in the bushfires. And the key role that Greening Australia is playing here is developing a national seed and landscape restoration strategy as part of a increasingly resilient but fire-sensitive landscape. I am very conscious of time here, so I'm going to keep moving. In this slide deck, there is a video which pretty much captures everything that I've spoken about so far and summarises it all in a 3-minute video. I won't show it just in the interest of time, because I know you've got other things you need to get to. But what I will also finish on before we take some questions is just point you towards a couple of links that I've got in here, which goes back to how I think Rotarians can get involved, which is a traditional way of getting involved for a donation of time and money, thinking about how technology and innovation works in terms of scaling ecosystem restoration to meet the great challenges of the day. And then finally, the thinking around market-based approaches to restoration. So Pat, I will pause there now just because of time. We started a little bit late, but I know you need to get back on track.
Appreciate that, Brendan. I'm just wondering if there are any questions for anybody. I have just one perhaps. Could you just sum up again the advice that you would give to all the Rotarians that are listening today and who will be listening in the future through these broadcasts about how they can do their bit to green the world?
Okay, thanks.
Apart from the big picture stuff, but how can
Yep.
what can they be doing?
Yes, so So, well, as Rotarians, individual Rotarians, and as you said there earlier, Pat, I'm very familiar with Rotary. I was a group study exchange participant back in 2011, and my journey with Rotary actually started a lot longer before that. So I'm as familiar as you can be with Rotary as a non-Rotarian. I've always been a little bit surprised that environment hasn't sat higher in your focus areas, given the global network that you have. So I'd very much encourage you within your groups to push for environment to take a higher profile in Rotary. Secondly, is it's very, very easy to get involved in local activities. In Australia, we would call it a land care group or a friends of group, or simply just by making a donation around tax time each year. There's so many things that you can do at an individual level, such as plant a tree, donate some of your time. If you've got a background as an accountant, you might be able to join a local environment organisation and help manage their finances. As I said there before, the people that we've employed in Greening Australia in the last couple of years have a breadth of skills and experience that we've never seen in our sector before. And Rotarians are a highly skilled, capable group. And what I don't think you need to do is reinvent the wheel and start your own programs that compete with the existing environmental organisations. I think Rotary needs to think at two levels, Pat. Number one is how can I as an individual best contribute and what's my skill set, and find a way to actually allocate your skills into that. But secondly, if you have a look at what's happening around the world at the moment, and particularly in Australia, is governments and institutions are struggling to coordinate and collaborate and communicate, etc. Rotary is best in class at that, at using this ecosystem model, this international network of capability, at moving skills and network and influence around in a coherent network. Is the environment needs that. The environment needs that, which is why I'm saying if environment's a focus area, Rotary has a big contribution to make in that area. So I would encourage you, Pat, to think at two levels: is the individual level, three levels, the individual level within your club and your district, and then thirdly, within that club and district at an international level, how you can contribute. And hopefully I've been able to answer that.
Thank you, Brendan. I'm sure everyone appreciates the wisdom of your answer. And I might have to move on, and perhaps we can respond to other questions at a later time. So look, thank you very much, Brendan, for your amazing story today of the work Greening Australia about restoring Australia's natural environment. And I'm sure people have learned a great deal that they could take back to their own situation in their own countries from around the world.